we're going to tell you a little bit about what happens once your grant is submitted to NIH or whatever. Well, this is specifically about NIH reviews. So we're going to give you a little bit of a preview about what happens, and please feel free to stop and ask questions. There are two sides to this grant writing and reviewing process. So before your grant goes in, you're going to be working with a program officer who will be guiding you about what the best mechanism might be for you, you'll find the program officer that best fits at the institute that best fits what you would like to do. But once your grant goes in, then it's going to switch over to another side of the institute. So it will end up going... we'll talk about that a little bit. It'll go to the Center for Scientific Review, and they'll decide what study section it should go to, what is the best fit. It'll go to the reviewers who will sit on that study section or who are brought in for that particular review. They will read it, just give it scores, discuss it, and then it then goes on to the Advisory Council, and they make the final decisions regarding funding. So it's really important to point out that we're always told at study section, never use the F word, funding. It's not our job to say what gets funded or what doesn't get funded. It's our job to evaluate the science. Okay, so as I said, when you send your grant in, it will go to the Center for Scientific Review, and they will decide where it should go after that. So they have a number of responsibilities. They have to check to make sure that you have submitted everything that you're supposed to and that you have followed the instructions. If you have not, if your font is too small or you haven't included what you're supposed to, they can choose to send it back to you and not have it go under review. So you need to follow the directions very carefully. I've written a number of grants, and every time I do, I download the instructions and I read them from cover to cover, and I highlight the important areas because the instructions do change and the things that they're looking for can vary. So I would recommend that you do that and follow the directions quite carefully. As I said, they'll decide where your grant should go, and that will depend on a number of things, but primarily it depends on the area of your research. So, for example, what if you send in a grant on speech perception in elderly people? Should that go to NIDCD, or should that go to the Institute on Aging? And so there are times when you're not sure or when it's not clear from your proposal. To avoid that, you should be talking with the program officer at your institute where you would like it to go to get guidelines about how to frame the question and frame your research in a way that will make it fit for a particular institute. They will then assign the application to a specific institute or a center. And after that, it gets an identification number that allows us to track it. And then finally, it gets assigned to a scientific review group, which are commonly called study sections. So, as I said, referral to a particular study section is primarily based on two things. One is, what is the grant mechanism that you're applying for? So different types of grants go to different review panels. And then it also depends, as I said, on your area of research, your population, what kinds of things you're proposing to do. So you can be prepared for that by going on to the NIH website and looking at the various topics that are covered by the different study sections and planning ahead to make sure that your grant goes to the study section that you're interested in. Almost all of the grants are referred to study sections that are administered within the Center for Scientific Review, but there are a few that are not, and I think that they will be on the next slide. Okay, so outside, the Center for Scientific Review covers all of NIH, but there are some grant mechanisms that are reviewed internally within NIDCD. So the fellowship awards, the F31, which is the predoctoral fellowship, and the F32, the postdoctoral fellowship, those are typically reviewed by an ad hoc study panel or study section. And what does that mean? That means that the scientific review officer will select people for that particular review based on the grants that have come in and on their areas of expertise. So typically that will be a much smaller panel than a standing study section where they're going to be reviewing a much larger number of grants. And for those of you who've been on these ad hoc panels, would you say that's correct, that they're typically smaller panels? That's been my experience. Then the K awards and the training grants, the T grants, those are reviewed by CDRC, which I believe stands for Communication Disorders Review Committee, and that is the standing committee for NIDCD. So they review all of the training mechanisms. I know, Mario, you were on CDRC for a while and did a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And so they do that. And Dan Sclair is the program officer for all of the training mechanisms, and he will be here tomorrow, I believe. Is that right, Margaret? He'll be here tomorrow to talk with you. I've worked with him. I had a K Award many years ago, and he's very helpful and very motivated to help young people get funding. So take advantage of his expertise if you're interested in those kinds of mechanisms. Okay? And as I said, there is a standing study section for CDRC, but many times they're going to bring in extra people or form these extra ad hoc panels to review specific grants. And why do they do that? Based on the expertise needed for the grants that are submitted. Okay, how do you get assigned to the quote-unquote right study section? And the example that Mario gave you a little bit earlier about, well, could you go to LCOM or could you go to auditory study section? That was actually something that happened when Mario and I both worked at Indiana University Medical School. And what happened, well, let me tell you how you do get the right one. You can ask that you should submit a cover letter with your grant, asking to be assigned to a particular study section and explaining why it might be the most appropriate one. You should also think about the title of your application. So many years ago, Mario and I both oversaw 2 separate R01s at Indiana, and we called one the Speech Perception Grant, which I oversaw, and we called one the Speech Production Grant, which Mario oversaw, but we worked on both together. And we had this wonderful idea that we were really interested in perceptual processing, and so we were going to change the speech perception title to spoken language processing in children with cochlear implants. So we did, but we didn't submit a cover letter to go with it, and it went from having always been reviewed in the auditory study section to the LCOM study section, where it was not favorably reviewed. So we learned a really important lesson. The next time when we revised it, we changed the title back to something that was more appropriate for auditory study section. And so we made 2 errors there. One error was we changed the title to something that wasn't clear, and the other error was that we did not submit a cover letter requesting a specific study section.
There's a question.
You can actually, if you feel that there is someone who would be a potential reviewer but may not be a suitable person to review your grant for a variety of reasons, you can specifically ask that the grant not go to that particular person. And it might be things like you have a long-standing disagreement in terms of the theoretical motivation for your work, or but you should be really careful about doing this. Do it judiciously. Don't overuse it. Don't send a letter and say, I don't want these 10 people to review my grant. Do it very carefully and judiciously. Now, it's really important to know that you cannot do the opposite, which is to suggest potential reviewers for your grant. And I know of someone who did that, and she was told, every single person that you listed here now cannot be a reviewer for your grant. So you don't want to make that mistake.
It is a good idea to emphasize in your letter the expertise that is needed to review your grant. That's very helpful to the SRO. Very helpful.
Yes, very good point. Thank you. Okay, so once it gets to the study section, the scientific review officer will then decide who the grants should go to be reviewers. And so what happens then is the scientific review officer will choose 2 or 3 people to review that grant carefully, and we will read them ahead of time and critique them and give them written scores for each of the sections that you have seen and you will see again many times over the next 3 days: significance, innovation, approach, etc. So we assign each of those sections a score. We write a narrative in bullet points for each of those sections. What about significance? What about innovation? And then we assign an overall impact score. So based on all of these individual sections, what do we give it as our one overall impact score? And we submit those critiques in writing onto the NIH website. Can I see what other people have written? No, not until the submission date has come. do. And once everything is submitted, then it's opened up, and you can see the critiques and the written scores of other reviewers, the other two reviewers who have looked at the grant carefully. So that's what happens before we get to the study section meeting. I always look at what the critiques are from the other investigators, and I read them carefully for two reasons. First, I want to see if I've missed something, because as Elena said, you're not as equally familiar with each research area for the grants that you're assigned. So I want to see if I've missed something and if they've brought out a point that's really good. And then the other reason is because I think I want to be an advocate for the grants that I think are strong. So if someone has made a criticism where I feel that they've missed something in the grant or they've misinterpreted, then I want to go back and read the grant carefully again and be prepared at the meeting to be able to make points that potentially rebut that criticism. And that's how you really become a good advocate for grants in your area, or in any grant that you think is good. Okay, so now we've done all that. We get to study section. What happens? For AUD study section, it's usually about a day and a half of meetings. And what happens is we discuss a limited number of the grants. We can't discuss them all. We don't have time to do that. And so we actually discuss, I think there's a slide later on, we discuss somewhere between 50 and 40% of the grants that are submitted. And so what happens is that the primary reviewer will be asked to summarize the grant. All three reviewers go around and give their preliminary score, and you can change that if you want to, based on, you don't have to say exactly what you submitted. If you think, I read the other critiques and I don't think it's as good as I thought it was, or, gee, I think it's better, you can change your preliminary score. Everyone gives a preliminary score. Then the three reviewers discuss it. The primary reviewer gives a brief summary of the grant, and they ask you to keep that to 5 minutes approximately. So you don't have time to convey a lot of detail about the grant. You have to hit the highlights and give them a basic idea of what the investigator proposes to do. And then you also comment on each of the various criteria. So you comment on what is the significance, the innovation, et cetera, et cetera. Then that's the primary reviewer. The secondary reviewer then is asked, do you have anything different to add? Or they don't want you to get up and say the same thing all over again. And then the third reviewer. And typically, primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers have differing degrees of expertise, with the primary reviewer being the most familiar with the work. The tertiary reviewer may just be asked to write a brief paragraph, and it may be that you just have you have expertise in one small area of the grant. Like for me, sometimes I've been asked to review grants where they're including some testing of hearing impaired individuals, and I can comment on that. All right, and then what happens is then the discussion is open to everyone sitting around the table, and they can ask questions, they can comment, and then once the discussion has sort of come to a conclusion, the three reviewers are asked once again, okay, what's your final overall impact score? What's yours? What's yours? And after that, all of the reviewers around the table, many of whom have not read the grant, are expected to assign a score. So they are assigning a score based in large part on your ability to convey the strengths and the weaknesses of this application. Right? Any comments? So as I think you've heard many times already, it's important to write this so that people who don't have exactly your expertise can understand it and be your advocate. Okay. The scientific review officer will choose the assigned reviewers, and what we talked a little bit about primary, secondary, and tertiary. First, she will look. Well, mine is a she, Lynn Lutke. But first, they will look and see who is already on the panel who has expertise in this area, and they will go there first. Then if they find that they don't have anyone who's really appropriate, they will ask ad hoc members to participate in the review process as well. Those ad hoc members may come to study section if they are reviewing a certain number of grants, or they may simply call in for a specific time period and review just a limited number of grants. The difficulty in that is that oftentimes they're not calibrated. So we've been reviewing a number of grants. We know what a 3 means. We know what a 2 means. And they haven't heard the discussion, and so that can be a little tricky. Okay. Okay. And then each reviewer gets about 10 to 12 grants. It depends on the type of grant mechanism. Last time I think I got 10. The time before that I got 12. For a 12-page application, for a research plan of 12 pages, like an RO1, I spend about 8 hours. So I read it really carefully. I make a number of comments as I'm going through. I may be particularly slow, but I really want to be sure that I understand it and that I'm giving it the attention that it's due. So this is a huge commitment on behalf of reviewers, and we all do it because we want to move forward the science in our field and support young people. So that's why when you hear people talk about being cranky, it's not because we're inherently cranky people. It's because we really take it seriously and we want to be advocates for you.
Can I add just one little thing? So if you are the third reviewer and you have that sort of peripheral expertise that's related to the topic, and I'm like Karen, I try to do the best I can do, read it, and it takes a long time, then you even do a little research on your own. If there's a concept that you don't quite understand, you go and look on it. So many reviewers go above and beyond the just surface reading, no matter which role they're assigned.
Mm-hmm. Although I am one of those that doesn't read the appendix regularly.
No, I don't either.
8 hours on one grant.
But I do like to look at the internet and say, I don't get that. So, what is that? And then I find out more about it.
Okay. All right, so what happens when they read the proposal? Well, they read the specific aims. I read the whole thing, but why are we reading each section? So we're looking at the specific aims to get the overall impression. The specific aims are like one of the most important parts of the grant. It's the first thing you see, and it sets the tone for what is the purpose of this grant, why is it important. I think you really should spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about your specific aims. Obviously, we read the grant and make notes, and one of the things I really like as a reviewer, you'll hear this, keep it easy for your reviewer. When I come to the significance section, somewhere within that paragraph or a page or whatever you've decided to allocate to that, I would like to see a sentence that says, this work is significant because. And then I say, oh, here it is. I can look for that, right? And I want to know, why is it theoretically significant and why is it clinically important or significant? And it may not be both, but if it is, make sure you tell me that. So then we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses for each of the review criteria. The NIH gives you a template to do this review. It lists the criteria. Then it has a thing that says strengths, and you list them in bullet points, but not just a phrase, a sentence or two or three about each of those. And then the same thing, a weakness. So you're supposed to look at each of them. And when you come to the point where you have to make a score for that, you're going to weigh, well, how many strengths are there as opposed to how many weaknesses, and how important do you weight each of these? So it's important to do that carefully. Then you come up with a score, and then, as I said, you submit your written critique and your score. So it asks you to enter a score for each of the sections, and then an overall impact score, and then you attach your written critique, and you do all this on the website. Okay, so study section is about 10 to 20 people who have expertise inside and outside your area of interest. On the auditory study section, there are maybe 2 or 3 of us, like me, who have clinical interests or have interests in hearing science in kind of an applied way. And then there are a number of people who are engineers or molecular biologists. There are people from all different kinds of basic science backgrounds and clinical or applied backgrounds. And so many times they'll be talking about something that you don't know anything about, like knockout mice. I don't know very much about knockout mice, but I hear that word a lot. So again, you have to be prepared to listen to the presentations and weigh what they say. You can find the study section membership online, and you should probably look at that. It doesn't mean that when your grant goes to that particular study section, it will be exactly the same, because there are ad hoc members that are added as needed, and there are also the typical term is 3 times a year for 4 years, or now they've changed it to 2 times a year for 6 years. And so someone may have rotated off, or someone may not be going to that particular meeting, but it gives you some general idea. Who runs the meeting? The meeting is run by the scientific review officer, the person who assigned you the grants. And then there's also a study section chair. And that person is someone who's been on that study section for 2 or 3 years usually, and they take that role for an entire year. It's a huge responsibility. They guide the discussion. They listen to all of their critiques. After the final scores have been submitted again, they summarize the discussion. So they have to be, even if it's in an area they know very little about, so they have to be really on top of their game, paying attention and listening. The scientific review officer is there to keep things flowing, to make sure that you're following all of the guidelines. She looks for conflicts of interest before you actually get there and will notify you who you're in conflict with. So he or she is a very important member also. And the scientific review officer might step in, or the chair might step in and say, well, it seems to me that we're sort of reiterating the same points, and so let's move on to kind of keep things going. Or they might say, gee, I've heard an awful lot of criticisms. This would be more the chair rather than the SRO, but I've heard an awful lot of criticisms about this grant. Why is it getting a 2? So they try to keep you calibrated and keep you going. Which grants are discussed? It's based on their preliminary scores. So when you submit your overall impact score, those are ranked. They draw a line at the midpoint, and now I think it's more like 40% are discussed and 60% are not. So the idea then is to give the panel time to really focus on the grants that are likely to have the highest impact and be most significant. And before the meeting, you can ask if a grant that you reviewed or anyone reviewed gets a score that puts them under that 50% point, or over, however you want to look at it. You can ask to have that grant discussed, and it will be. Why would you do that? What would motivate you? I've asked for that before when I remember there was a grant where I think it got a 2, a 3, and an 8. 1 is good, 9 is bad. And so then I thought, when there's such a discrepancy in scores, let's discuss it. And the likelihood that it will make it all the way through is small, but you'd at least like them to have the opportunity to get the discussion and feedback. Okay, let's see. How are conflicts handled? If you work with someone, if you are at the same institution as a grant, as the PI that submitted the grant, you may not participate, and you must leave the room. And you don't score it. If you have worked very closely in the recent past, that would be good if you could do that. In the recent past, then you will be in conflict and you leave the room. So when you're in conflict, you leave. You don't listen to the discussion and you don't score it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the new, quote-unquote new, because it's not as new anymore as it used to be, the new scoring system. So as I said, there are Criterion Scores and an overall impact score. This is a little bit hard to see, but every reviewer is given this as a guideline. So we are supposed to follow this. A 1 is the best you can get, and a 9 is the worst you can get. And you can see that 1, 2, and 3 correspond to high impact, etc. 4 through 6, medium impact, 7 through 9, low. And then it gives you a descriptor, and then it gives you some guidelines. So if there's something that's very strong with a few minor weaknesses, then that would get a 3. So you're supposed to use this, kind of keep this in mind as you're scoring. And as a new reviewer, you're always really nervous when it's time to see the other people's scores and the other people's discussion of the grant. As you become more seasoned, you find that usually you're pretty much. There are a few times where you're very discrepant, but for the most part, people are pretty close. What they don't want to see is that everything is clustered in 1, 2, 3, and 4, because then you can't separate out a very good grant from a good grant. They encourage you, if you see one that is really not very good, give it a 9 or give it an 8 or something like that, so that we can spread the range out. And that's when we talk about calibration. Okay, the scores are given separately for each category, and I'm not going to spend very much time on this because you saw them in Elena's talk, but these are the criterion, and just quickly, these are some guidelines that we're given as reviewers. When we're looking at significance, will it make a difference? Will it move the field ahead? And how important is this problem? And really, the significance really is a very important. I think significance and approach are probably the two most heavily weighted aspects of a grant. But the rest have to be good too. And then they look at investigators, whether you're productive, whether you've had research funding, if you have a good track record. If the researcher is going to be your mentor on a training mechanism, then they would like to see, have they had previous trainees? Where did they go? Were they successful? So you have to think about that. They want to make sure that you have the skills and techniques. So I remember reviewing a grant where it was an outstanding grant, but it was proposing to test children and adults, and no one on the team had ever had any pediatric experience. And so the next time they revised it, they added a person with pediatric experience, and it ended up getting funded. So we're going to be looking for things like that. Innovation, again, Elena talked about this, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But things don't have to be innovative. It doesn't have to be innovative to be a good grant. They would like to see innovation. And innovation can take a variety of forms. You might be developing a new tool or a new paradigm. You might be using an existing tool or paradigm in a new population. So there can be a variety of things.
That's actually a tough section to review, I think. I often don't know what to say, but those are the sorts of things that you would comment on. It can be an existing tool that you're using, but you're applying it to a different population, or you're extending a paradigm from one science to another. Things like that can come under that umbrella.
Approach is probably one of the most important sections. And when I'm reviewing, and I think most reviewers are like this, you have to consider all of these things, the methods, the rationale. The guidelines now say that reviewers should not focus on the details of the study, but on the conceptual issues. But you have to put enough details in there for us to know that you understand the work and that you can do it. So, and one big no-no that I've really seen lately is that people try to put the details of their approach into the human subjects section.
Oh my.
Here are my participants. Here's what I'm going to do. We are really instructed to ignore. I mean, our job when we review the human subject section is, do we have any concerns about safety and protection of the subject? But it's not to be saying, now we know they're going to do that. So you have to think, it's a challenge. You might have 6 pages. You might have 12 pages. You have to think about a way. You should always include a power analysis. They want to see that. And you should include a description, however brief, of your statistical analysis, because they're looking for that. And then the environment is, can you do the work where you are? Do you have the subjects that you need? Do you have the equipment and the infrastructure? They don't want to see, you can certainly put in equipment you need to do the work, but they don't want to think that you're padding the grant so that you can build a lab using money from that. So you have to be careful about that. I do cochlear implant research with children. I always include in my environment or in my approach the number of potential subjects that have been implanted and meet our criteria and are available for recruitment. So I show them that I've done my homework, and because you'll get grants from people who say they want to do X, Y, and Z, but they're nowhere near subjects. So think about that and make sure you include that.